Thank you, Willie.
Yeah, of course.
How you doing, fellas? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure, doing well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's an honor to have you both here. If you guys haven't heard, my name is Shaadie Nunnally. I'm a representative of the Utah Black Artists Collective here. Also have my own companies that I'm a part of, Mac Life Entertainment LLC, Mac Life Community. We do music entertainment and also community outreach events for family in needs, youth services and things like that. I'm originally from the Bay Area, Northern California, Vallejo, and I've been out here in Utah since 2016. I've just been trying to help expose the culture and urban culture here, as well as just the scene of Blacks and colors in Utah and the inclusion and diversity that Utah is very open with. I have worked my way up to assignment editor at ABC4. They've given me my own segment on Good Things Utah, A Shot with Shaadie, where I speak with local entrepreneurs and businesses. So with Willie and Utah Humanities and UMOCA, where I book out of as well, it's just a great collaboration. So I'm just happy to be a part of this.
Awesome. Good on you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So first, starting off, I'd like to speak with you, Matthew. If you can please just go ahead and say your name, give your title, and your involvement in this film.
Yeah, so I'm Matthew Van Meter, and I wrote Deep Delta Justice, which is the book that the film is based on.
Nice, nice. And Mr. Eli, if you can also say your name and your role within the film, although we did see you on screen, but just for those recording purposes.
Well, my name is Lolis Eric Eli, and I'm the son of Lolis Edward Eli, one of the lawyers who helped Mr. Duncan and who helped bring his lawyer into the fold in the civil rights movement in New Orleans.
Great, great. Thank you for having me both. Matthew, you're the writer of this book. Can you just let the people know, how did you come about this case and what was your interest in this case to bring it to life in book? Yeah,
sure. So I report on criminal justice issues. And I mean, I really stumbled into this case kind of by accident. And it just had surprised me that I didn't know that the right at the center of this case, the right to jury trial, hadn't been applied to the states until 1968 by this case. And then I was further surprised to find that nobody had written about it and really dug into it. And at the time, sort of in 2015, Richard Sobel was still very much alive. Gary Duncan, of course, still is very much alive. And and so I really dropped everything and just, like, the story felt so important to me. As somebody who reports on criminal justice issues. And so that was sort of the start of it. And then it grew to encompass all the issues that you saw really beautifully portrayed in the film. I had no idea how big and how many tentacles the story had into the civil rights movement, into further criminal justice issues, and really into the story of Americans securing rights for themselves, not just in the South, but everywhere.
So in your discovery of this case and got you interested in bringing this forward to more of the public, as you were developing this book, what type of roadblocks or hurdles did you reach, if any? How hard or difficult or easy was it in some cases that may have shocked you in areas in creating this book and then getting it out there to the public? Yeah, good question. And parts of it were super easy, and I mean, I'm really lucky in that in reporting on criminal justice, like, one of the amazing things about our court system is it's open. How often can you get, like, verbatim transcripts from the past? It rarely happens, but in the court system, really, it's amazing what you can find. But the people behind that, and the legal record is, sort of speaks for itself, but the access to the people behind that is what makes it really important. And it took a while. I'm a bona fide Yankee. I live in Detroit, Michigan now. I grew up on the East Coast. I'd never been to the Deep South before I started reporting this book. And people were rightly, a little skeptical of me at first. I think, I don't know if I would have talked to me. It took about a year of going down and just showing up, right? And not wanting anything from people except to talk to them, and to show that I wasn't just there to,
helicopter in and go off with their stories and move on to the next thing, that I cared, and I do. And after about a year, folks started to open up, and then that really became, for me, the most important part of the book. Was once I was given just a little bit of access to this community, this amazing community in New Orleans and Plaquemines Parish. I really, the book became much more about them and about that. And I remember skimming over it a few months ago in preparation for a talk I was giving, and I was like, 2/3 of this book wouldn't have happened without the hours and hours and hours that people spent, talking with me. And so what started out as a roadblock, people sort of mistrust of me, understandable, kind of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed white boy coming down from the north to, gather stories or whatever. I think that once I showed up enough that people understood that wasn't what I was about, that turned into the book's strength and into the story's strength.
So you actually went down to Louisiana and physically started to meet some of these people. Now, when you say these people, now we know that this actual case and things happened, over 4 decades ago. So I'm assuming you're speaking with people that are maybe a generation or two removed. So when you were going through these roadblocks with these people, what type of people can you speak specifically on? As in, were they just kind of like home people around the city, the parish, that kind of knew of stories that then may have led you to closer and closer sources? Was it the general public? Was it lawyer people? Was it white, black? What kind of people were you, for lack of a better word, kind of attacking and pursuing first to get information?
Yeah. I mean, good question. One of the things that's really lucky, that I feel really lucky about, is everyone was so young when all this was happening. I mean, Gary Duncan was 18, 19 when this was all going on. The kids on the side of the road, they were in middle school, but even the lawyers, Richard Sobel was 28, 29 when this was going on. Lolis, your daddy couldn't have been much older than that.
About 4 or 5 years older than Richard.
Yeah, and so there were, and unfortunately I missed Lolis's father by just a couple of years, which is a real shame. But for me, and I was talking to, you asked a question about who I was talking to. It was it's a number of different types of people. It was white people and black people in Plaquemines Parish, people in New Orleans, people who were from Plaquemines Parish or New Orleans and who had settled, largely after Katrina in other places, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, or Texas, or California, or wherever they wound up, and real sort of scattered around, but who had roots there, who were part of the story. But all of these people, dozens and dozens of them, particularly for when I was in the book, I spent a lot of time talking about the school desegregation in Plaquemines Parish, which was really just sort of, it hits all of the buttons of massive resistance to integration, and also the innovation of anti-racist lawyers trying to, break down the barriers the schoolhouse gate before the Supreme Court, got conservative again. And nobody had really done that history before. And so I talked to dozens of people, white and black, who had been part of the first integrated classes in Plaquemines Parish public schools, but they had all been, they were, sort of early retirees at this point in their lives. They had been in their teens in the mid to late 60s. So I was really lucky to find that much in living memory. And because more and more of that period is slipping from us. The memory of it by the people who did it and lived it is slipping from us. And so that felt really important to me.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Lolis, for you, with Matthew going down to New Orleans and like he said, kind of just being a bushy-tailed white guy from the north, from East Coast, and going down there and bringing up this thing that was, maybe over and done for some people. Maybe some things didn't want to be brought up for those down there. When did you hear about this book and his research and him being down there? And did you guys cross paths? And if so, when and how did you feel about that with your being so young at that time of it actually happening and having firsthand knowledge being so close? How was it to find this man coming down into your neck of the woods and kicking this back up?
Well, I'm infinitely grateful to Matthew for having done this book, because there are thousands of these stories, not all of them as important as this one to have ended up in the Supreme Court. But if we are to have any hope for getting out of our current political malaise, any other problems we have, it's the hope to be derived from heroic stories like the one that Matthew uncovered. To say I have firsthand knowledge would be an exaggeration, in that I was a toddler when this was taking place. And to be honest, much of this has been an education for me. So again, I have to thank Matt for that. I think I paid more attention to my father's work in his politics than many young boys and young men did. But this particular case, I was not really familiar with. I got an inkling of it when one of the civil rights leaders from Plaquemine Parish died. This must have been 20 years ago. And I went with my father and Richard Sobel to the funeral, and I'm trying to remember the name of that person. It's a family, and some of those family members are still alive. So I had some sense of what was going on. I regret not having paid greater attention to it. But my father had a sort of blessing and a curse, in that he lived longer than a lot of his contemporaries. If you talk about the people who were involved in the civil rights movement, who were roughly my father's age, they were dying like in the 90s and the early 2000s. Richard Haley, Aretha Haley, Avery C. Alexander, A.L. Davis. These people were long dead before my father died in 2017, which means that people who can collaborate things that he said and did were few by the time of his death. And Matthew, to make you feel at least slightly better, you would have to have reached my father at least a year, perhaps 2 years before his death in 2017, to have really gotten a good sense of what was going on. So it wasn't as if you just missed him by minutes, you missed him by a couple of years. So it was certainly not your fault. But part of what I think is problematic is, even in cities where Martin Luther King's legacy is celebrated annually in January, there's this assumption that somehow Dr. King came down from on high with Rosa Parks. And there really is a lack of understanding and a lack of appreciation for the local efforts that were taking place during and before the 1960s. And there certainly is a lack of appreciation for people like Mr. Duncan, who said, I'm not a civil rights leader per se. I'm a man demanding my humanity, and will govern myself accordingly and let the chips fall where they may.
With that knowledge of knowing that, like both of you said, and even in the film, Mr. Duncan's story is not just a one-off. It's many has happened like that before, and unfortunately after, even coming up all the way as recent as George Floyd in 2020. So it's nothing new, unfortunately, but with being there in Louisiana and experiencing this a little more than maybe other parts of the country, being in the North, how often over the years since that time with Duncan has anyone ever come in and done what Matthew has done? Has anyone tried to do this before, and what has been maybe reasonings for their success or not so much success in your opinion?
I'm thinking offhand about the book about the Deacons for Defense and Justice, an organization that's alluded to in Matthew's work. And there was a book by a Tulane professor whose name escapes me now, who did that book. Also, I think about Karen Cosey Bell, who did a book called Romanticism, Revolution, and the Afro-Creole Protest Tradition, which looks at the history of civil rights struggle in Louisiana, beginning with the Louisiana Purchase, and that actually before that. Again, this notion that suddenly Black people decided in the 1960s that we wanted to be human beings and treated as such That is utterly false. Another thing I think is very important to mention in this context is that Nancy Bursky, the director whose film your audience had just seen, what she did was take Matthew's work and put it in the context of other people who were similarly conscious and similarly willing to take the brave steps to try to change our system. So in that sense, it becomes clear that for all the great things about Matthew and about Mr. Duncan, they are part of a much, much larger tapestry of people who've sought to bring justice and democracy to these shores long before this case, and continue to do so, as you alluded to, even now.
Yes. Matthew, back to you. With your history with criminal justice, and I would assume you would be privy to a lot of different cases that others may not know, or being able to look into, that may get your blood boiling. But over the time of your studies, you found this particular case and wanted to bring that to life in book. How do you feel the success of this? Why do you feel that your book and your research has gone to the heights that it's gone now? Do you feel it's time? Do you feel maybe you've just put in a little bit more effort, luck? What, in your opinion, is the reason why your book has been able to grow into what it's been right now?
I mean, I think look, the best I can hope to do as a journalist and as a storyteller is to channel in a way that audiences can and readers can hold on to the honest experiences of other people, right? That's my job. And so I think the thing that drew me to the story, that has always drawn me to the story and that draws everybody to the story, is the characters. It's the people, the people who lived it. That's what makes the story what it is. It's not the Supreme Court. There's all sorts of cases that go to the Supreme Court. Most of them don't have a book about them. Most of them will never have a book about them. This one needed a book. It needed a film. It needed people to know about it. These people needed people to know about them. And I think, for me, it's, look, the one of the things about reporting this book that was so interesting to me was that Plaquemines Parish and New Orleans are such interesting, unique places, unique in the context of the United States and unique from each other. They're very different places, despite being right next to each other. And that was sort of an education for me. The other part of the education for me is there is nothing remotely quaint or civil rights inflected or 1960s about Gary Duncan's case. There are right now, in any city any of us is in, people getting arraigned for battery for something they didn't do, right? Like that's not a North-South thing. That's not a Louisiana thing. It is unfortunately still very much a black-white thing. Although I tell you, so I work with incarcerated people. I was the assistant director of Shakespeare in Prison for a long time up here in Detroit. And let me tell you, it is when you're staring down, the barrel of the law's gun, it doesn't much matter who you are as long as you're poor and vulnerable. And that is what Gary Duncan was. And what made him different from all the other people is that he and his family decided to stand up and fight. And then there was this confluence of events, because normally that happens and you get smacked down, and you get smacked down hard. And he didn't, because he had the foresight and the good fortune to team up with this lawyer who was willing and able to take the case to a Supreme Court when that case's time had come, and like there's a lot of needles to thread in that path, which is part of what makes it such a good story, but also part of what made reporting and writing the book so interesting for me is I was seeing the same themes that I see in courthouses all over this country every day, repeated over and over and over again. And it's basically no different, right? There are, for all of the kind of quirkiness and uniqueness of the story, the facts of Gary Duncan's case on their face as a legal case happen every single day, everywhere. That hasn't changed.
Okay, so this question I'd like both of you to answer. Matthew, you can start first. You guys both have history connections with criminal justice system, prison system, those being incarcerated, those affected. You guys are obviously of different age and generation and different background, but still are fighting and exposing the same type of cause and have different ways of getting to that. With both of your experiences over time, from knowing what happened with the studies with this case, Duncan versus Louisiana, all the way up to now, 2022, with things still happening, what do you feel can be learned, not from only from just this case, but other cases that we know of, as well as cases and things from you guys' personal experience that you just see still kind of works in some areas, but not fully works, and just some things just still happen regardless? What are your opinion? What do you think can be done differently with all of this knowledge now?
I think there's a lot to learn about how to organize and how to innovate. And for me, I guess I had always thought of Jim Crow as this legal system that was like put in place and then like left. It was like this backwards looking thing, and it was not. Jim Crow was highly innovative. It was a system that was put in place by brilliant lawyers, each trying to out innovate the others and each trying to out innovate the people who were trying to break that system down. And the balance of power tipped for a little while in there. And when the balance of power tipped, cases like this one were able to come through, and the innovators on the side of integration and racial justice began to win. We have seen many of those victories eaten away at. We have seen recently an acceleration of the erosion of those rights that were won because the segregationists never stopped innovating. They just kept going. And we haven't been keeping pace, right? We haven't been keeping pace in the courts. I think we have been keeping pace in society, and it has not been easy, but you got to have the tough conversations before you start having the easy ones, right? And so I've been much happier with how society at large has begun to really grapple with issues of race. I'm very frustrated by a lot of the discussions we have about race and equity and social justice. But I feel like that's just sort of like a continual condition of somebody who's immersed in this stuff. You know, from a young age, I grew up Quaker, so I've been, sort of living and breathing this stuff since I was a little kid. And, but for me on the legal side, like who I'm frustrated with the lawyers and the legal organizations, right? And the people in the Justice Department who took their eye off the ball, for 15, 20, 30 years, and allowed people from the far right, who are the same people basically who've been around in the 60s and the 20s and the 1870s and all the other times, right? And let those lawyers run with the ball, and it seems to me like and it's difficult, but it seems to me like like an unforced error, and we are reaping what we sowed.
Well, what I would add to that is I think there's something that all successful movements have in common, whether we're talking about the Arab Spring or the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, or the efforts that brought about Reconstruction in the 1860s and so forth. A lot of it has to do with reaching a point where the common people are willing to put their lives on the line, because there are always individuals who are interested in agitating, but you get to the point where people are actually willing to join you. There's a sort of a joke around the Plessy versus Ferguson case that refers to this fable about the mice getting together and saying, well, I know how we can save ourselves from getting killed by this cat all the time. We just have to put a bell around its neck. And once we do that, we'll always know when it's coming. And they're like, yeah, that's a great idea. Who is going to actually put the bell on the cat's neck? And I think Gary Duncan demonstrated himself to be willing to do that. And with the recent Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen an increasing number of people willing to do that. To me, the lesson is that ordinary people have to, as best they can, decide what they're willing to do in support of or in participation with these sorts of movements. I think part of what we're seeing now is a real contrast in a vision of what the United States is. Now, it's striking that in Dr. King's most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, he talks about cashing a check written by the founding fathers some 200 years ago. The notion being that our fundamental character as Americans harkens back those idealistic times and those idealistic documents. And I think often Americans believe that that is the case, that we will revert to a kind of decency, when I fear the opposite is the case. There's always been massive indecency and injustice in the United States. And those of us who believe in freedom have to offer a different vision of the country, not so much a different vision of what it can be, but a very different vision of what it is.
With things still going on today, with the movement, like you mentioned, the Black Lives Movement, what I've been seeing is a less tolerable society of injustices of things over time. We've learned with Gary Duncan, we've learned with Rosa Parks, we've learned with others within the Black Panther movement and things like that around the country, that sometimes standing up, holding your ground still knocks us down and knocks us back and gets us frustrated. Despite all of those things going on, how do you still find the courage, find the energy, find the new ways and tactics to try to still expose these injustices and find new ways for the newer generations that may be less tolerable, but also less patient? Because there's been many marches, there's been many speeches, there's been many movies and documents that I know myself as a Black man raised by Black parents from the South, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia. I was indoctrinated in this. I was at Martin Luther King's house growing up all the time in Georgia. So I knew these things, and it was frustrating and annoying to me to march and do things in the 90s, feeling like there was no way out. Here we are, I'm 36 now, still seeing people being killed, still seeing injustices, still seeing people of all creeds fight for equality, but we're still hearing stories that are from 40 years ago that we never knew of, that is still like, see, it happened then, and see, it's happening now. Mm-hmm. How do you all still fight through that? And what are you all doing to make that change and to keep it fresh and not be so angry about it? Because I don't sense anger from you two, despite Lolis, your closeness with your father and being a Black Southern man there, and also Matthew, you learning these things for yourself as a white man. That anger doesn't seem to overpower you, it seems to drive you. But how do you steer other folks' angers or their emotions in the right way for positivity, for change?
Matthew, you want to start, or should I?
I can take that at first. I mean, for me, I don't know. Like I said, I grew up, I'm Quaker. I grew up in a Quaker family, you know, and for me, one of the things that meant was that the struggle was the point. That I wasn't raised with the idea that I'd live to see myself get there. I was, I guess, raised more with the idea that when we got there, we'd find another place to get, you know? And so I guess for me, and I feel overwhelmed with anger all the time about it, but it doesn't do any good. I mean, I can drive you, and that's good. You know, my ex-wife was a public defender, and I know a lot of public defenders you know, who are really driven by like just rage at the machine, and that can be really powerful force. It's not what drives me. and I think I would burn out on that. But for me, I think it's just understanding that the struggle is the point, and that we will not ever be in a utopian society. There will always be something to fight against. That's sort of the nature of human systems. We have a number of really, really persistent problems and inequalities in this country, particularly around race, but also around gender, around ability, and others. And it is frustrating to me that we've made less progress, that we've made as little progress as we have. But it's also, for me, I guess the fact that we're still struggling seems like that is just the nature of life. If you pay attention and care, is to struggle against the things that are wrong, because there will always be things that are wrong, and that means you got to fight against them, because otherwise you just get carried along with the tide, and then what good are you?
It's sort of interesting to hear you talk about me not appearing angry, because one thing I share with my late father is the inclination at times to respond angrily to stimuli that I think warrant the anger, though a calmer response might be more effective. I think about a story that I wrote about when I was a columnist at the Times-Picayune, about some young Black men who, upon hearing that the Catholic Church was desegregating, went to their church, St. Joseph the Worker, and sat in the front of the church. And the good white Catholics at that church said if they did it again the following week, they'd pay for it. And the good white Catholics came to church with tire irons and the like and beat these men senseless. When telling my father about that story, he reminded me of how important it was to actually be a part of an organization that would have a strategy to minimize the possibility of this sort of vigilante death, while also maximizing the possibility for success. The great writer Christopher Hitchens used to say that people would accuse him of being a knee-jerk liberal, which he was at the time of this writing. He said, well, if my knee failed to react when exposed to certain stimuli, I'd be very concerned. Which is to say that your angry reaction is appropriate, but it's not necessarily effective. And I would also say that to get a better response to your question, you're fortunate to be asking me this now rather than 20 years ago, when my anger was a bit less in control.
Yes, I say that coming from experience. Like I said, I was raised in the Bay Area of California, but my grandfather's side, my mother's side, they're from Georgia, Albany, Marietta, Savannah. So much so where it used to be called Blackstown before it was, I believe, Savannah way back in the day in the 30s when my grandparents were coming up. And then my dad's side, my patriarch side is North Carolina and Virginia, like really the sticks. We claim Raleigh, but we're from Pelham, a couple minutes from Danville, Virginia. So I was raised in the Bay Area, but every time I was on a vacation or a birthday or anything out of school, I was back south. So I was getting cultured in back in what the real heritage was. And I was seeing the anger from my grandmother, who was very fair skinned, and my grandfather, who was very dark skinned, and things like that. But they allowed me to know the truth, know our history, and not let it seep out with anger. But in my youth, I strayed away from movies such as A Crime on the Bayou, Roots, Mississippi Burning, things like that growing up, because it angered me. For one, I lived it and I heard stories about it from my relatives and family. So I wasn't mature enough to digest those movies, digest those documentaries, read those books without feeling so angry about how stupid this was, how stupid it was to be able to just get hauled off to jail for touching someone, but somebody else is saying that it was a hit. We have now known over time Emmett Till didn't whistle at the woman. The woman said she lied, and we all know the end result of that. Candidly speaking, doing this and seeing this film, I thought and felt I would be angry. Here we go again with another film that's going to boost my anger of something that is like dumb again, but we know what it was in those years, and it's not a surprise. Yet watching this film, it was very informative and very clear on not really being what I thought so angry. It wasn't the anger being projected. How do you all feel in that depiction of the film? Do you agree or not? Do you feel that it should have been more emotional driven? Should have been more fact driven? Were there things left out? What are you two's personal opinions of the depiction of the film? You, Lolis, as a descendant of a man that was firsthand going through that, and you, Matthew, as the discoverer of this story and the writer of the book. How do you feel it was depicted, and how did that come across to you?
Well, when the director of the film, Nancy Bursky, first approached me, part of the credential that she presented was the fact that she had directed The Rape of Reese Taylor. And if you don't want to see a film about a man wrongly accused of physical assault, you certainly don't want to see a film about a woman who's been brutally raped. But I felt that I had to watch it. It was an amazing film to me because it did not shy away from the horrors of this gang rape. But there was something very, very zen about it. You got the impression that Nancy Bursky had managed to put an appropriate artistic distance between her anger at this injustice and her duty as a storyteller. And what is so great about her approach to these films is that she doesn't incite you to the kind of frustration that might otherwise be the case. Now, mind what's also true of the three films and what I'm calling our sort of trilogy of people who wouldn't give in, is that these were all cases in which the people were victorious. We'd be having a very different conversation if Gary Duncan had been hauled off and disappeared in jail, or if Reese Taylor had suffered a similar fate. So in that sense, Nancy has chosen subject matter that is potentially uplifting and told these horrible stories in ways that are in fact quite lovely.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Lolis said. Nancy's work as an artist, I think, is something I really respect. And I know the ins and outs of this story as well as anyone at this point. I spent 5 years on that book, and still have like tens of thousands of pages of court documents sitting in a filing cabinet next to me. So, so I know plenty about the story, and it's but you got to reduce it down, right? I mean, my book is about 300 pages, and her film's about an hour and a half, and so you start figuring out what to take out, and through doing that, you craft it into a story, right? It's like sculpture or something, and and it was interesting to watch her take on it, which is different from mine, in part because it's a different medium, and I think you're right that one of the things that she captured, and that I hope I captured too in the book, is that is what Lola said, without shying away from the injustice of it, from the things that should make you angry and upset, it offers up hope, and I hope a little bit of motivation to continue the fight, because like I said before, anger on its own is sort of disempowering, but anger coupled with a sense of hope and a sense of mission and possibility is incredibly powerful. It's very empowering. And I think the difference there is it's not that you're not going to feel angry, it's that you feel like you have a direction to put it in, right? And that's what I hope the book does. That's certainly what the film does for me. And also to see, without making it some kind of kumbaya, everybody walks off into the sunset story, but to see the relationship, the like human relationship that was forged between Richard Sobel and Gary Duncan. I was privileged to spend a little bit of time very shortly with the two of them, very shortly before Richard's death with Nancy. We screened the film for Richard. It's about 2 months before he passed. And it was really something to watch these old men who had known each other since they were really, really young guys, who had done this incredibly important thing together, but most of all, they just liked each other,
Mm-hmm.
and like something about like the epic struggle that they went through being distilled down to in the film, that shot of them out on the California coast, just being friends together, gets at the humanity of the story and the humanity of the film for me. And I'm glad that you found it to be empowering, or at least hopeful, rather than simply, because rather than making you freeze up in anger, because I think that we need more of that. There's lots of hopeless stories out there. There are a lot of hopeless stories out there.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. A couple more things, specifically with the film. Like we said, this story, this case was little known, yet the effect, as Willie and I was speaking when it was done, was like, it's crazy to think that there could have been no jury trials if this did not go on. If this man's mother did not encourage him to fight and stand up for the truth and not just take a guilty plea, like was explained, many of them did and still even do now, just in fear of how big of an impact on the rest of the judicial system and people that have to go through the system are allowed to have this jury trial because of this case, yet it was so unknown. How do you think now with this book, now with this film, what is the hopes of getting the exposure and knowledge of this case to the generation now? I mean, we're streaming, we're doing all these things. There's so many other, like we were saying earlier, Black Lives Matters. There's a lot of organizations now still fighting for these things. How do we let the people know and the public know how important this case was back then and still is today through this film and book?
Well, I think the film may make it more accessible, even Matthew's book, and that you can watch the film in a little more than an hour. And it's also a way that groups of people can get together and be educated at the same time, as opposed to reading a book, which is very much a private experience. But the other thing I will say, and I don't want to overemphasize the importance of the film or the book too much, because it's not so important that you are familiar with this particular case, as important as this case was. What's more important is that we're all familiar with the history and legacy of struggle in this country and beyond, and take a stand as to our position within that legacy. Because they got 1,000 cases that establish rights that we may never know were the result of litigation. So I'm not so much concerned about this particular case or this particular film as I am about the notion that the struggle is constant and we must be engaged in it with that kind of mentality.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think, and obviously I think this story is important. I spent a lot of time, a lot of years of my life on it. But for me, what was important about it is that it is such a clear and compelling example of just what Lolis was saying about the need to keep the struggle and the need to educate yourself about the struggle and the need to keep yourself in it, right? Because that is its own struggle, is keeping yourself in the struggle, not letting yourself get kind of washed away, right? And I really, for me, from the beginning, for me, the book was, we are trying to build something in this country. Those of us who want to build it into, something better than what it is, and the book is a brick, it is not a useless thing, but it is also useful only insofar as it adds one more little piece to this massive thing. I feel really honored to, and I think the film is as well. And I feel really honored to have created one brick and been associated with this other brick. Because like that's I'm one person, and I sure don't have a lot of money or power. So like this is what I have. This is what I have to give. Is this one this one little brick, and hopefully more too. Before my time is done.
Nice, that's perfect. We seem to agree that this case was little known. This case was very important. Things like this wasn't a one-off shoot back then. Things like this are still continuing, and we can agree that unfortunately it may continue even past this time and past our time. And films like this, books like this, studies and talks like this will hopefully hope to continue adding to the fuel of, like you said, anger and hope of change and education for our people in the generations to come. But with you two being close with this, but also still having to look forward and understand the struggle is always continuous and there's always going to be a next fight, how difficult is it to dive into something like this, get all in, get your knowledge, expose it, bring it to fruition from a book to a film, to now being spoken on, to then moving on to what's next? Kind of two-part question. How difficult is it to let this go and go on to continue the fight of struggles, of new struggles with old history kind of things? And then specifically, what is next for you two? What is your next thing to continue this going?
Well, I think we have no choice but to move forward. This was not Richard's last case. One of the things that Richard alludes to in the film is the kind of leadership that Gary Duncan provided in the fishing community in Plaquemines, even after this case. And, if this is the last book Matthew wrote, it would be a great loss to all of us, not the least of which him. As far as me, I started working in television after spending most of my life as a journalist. So I'm now a TV writer, living mostly in Los Angeles, and trying to create TV shows that are both fun and also educational in various ways. My first job was on Trumay, a show that was in many ways about the rebuilding of New Orleans post-Katrina.
Love that show.
And I have a couple of shows in similar veins that I'm trying to get on the air.
He works in Hollywood when he's being that vague.
How about you, Matthew? What's coming up next for you?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, I mean, to me, I'll never get sick of this story. I certainly will never get sick of those people. I mean, I still go down to New Orleans often. I spend a lot of time with Gary, call him regularly. It's like that I've left a big part of myself down there. So I'm moving on from the book and doing events like this. I mean, this is the fun part. This is why I put in all that work. But the work is fun itself. I like digging into archives and talking to people and stuff. But I even like the writing, although I forgot about it when I'm doing the writing. So that in some ways I've moved on professionally in a lot of ways from the book, but emotionally, that part of my heart's always going to be there. That's not going anywhere. For next projects, I mean, as I mentioned, I was assistant director of Shakespeare in Prison for a long time. So the current project I've been working on, and is nearing fruition, is a critical edition of Shakespeare's Richard III, where all of the commentary, essays, footnotes, we've got poems in response to pieces of the play, all sorts of personal essays, and artwork was all created by an ensemble of incarcerated women here in Michigan. And so it'll be the first edition of Shakespeare with all of the non-Shakespeare writing done by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. So that's been nobody's ever really done that before, so that's been a learning experience as well. Sort of currently in the hunt for a publisher, so that's what I've been spending a lot of my time and energy on. And sort of, looking at other book ideas kind of in the same sort of vein. Right now, kind of working on a project about a sort of white supremacist group from the 20s and 30s here in Michigan that was a little too radical for the KKK. And again, one of the things that I really wanted to do after writing this book about the South, because it came very apparent to me very quickly that I grew up in a part of the country that's really hypocritical about race. Learned a lot about how the North was the safe place and all, the Underground Railroad, blah 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 blah. And like, I guess there's something to that, but it's also, I live in Detroit. These issues are at least as entrenched here, right? And as a Northerner and as a white person, I feel some responsibility to write about the place that I'm from, right? And about what people who look like me did, instead of going back out to some place that I'm not from. And so that's sort of, we'll see what comes of that, but that's what I've been working on most recently, just because the more I worked on this book and the more I went down to Louisiana, the more that the sort of Northern smugness about race and history bugged me. So I'm doing something about it. So how about that for using my anger, putting my anger to good use?
Got you. Now, before we get out of here, I kind of got a two-part question for both of you. One is, with this book and with this film, what would you like the viewers to get out of watching this film? What would you like them to do moving forward? And secondly, personally for you two, what is it that you would like the general public, those that interact with you, or even those that just may know of your work and maybe not even your name, not even who you are as a person, but just the work you put out there, what is it that you're trying to put out into the universe and leave as your stamp for those to remember and recognize you by, whether it's something you've done and they know who you are, or even if it's just some anonymous work that you've put out there and you want people to find?
Well, often people say that writers have only one subject, and even though they may write a bunch of different books that seem very different, they have sort of one subject. And I would hope that people would see in the essays and books that I've written and in the TV shows I'm trying to work on, that my subject was indeed social justice in much the way that Matt had written about. Back to your earlier comments about a lack of anger, I'd like to be able to inject a degree of humor into the work that I do. But nonetheless, at its core, my hope is that there's that sort of social justice thread that goes throughout. So that's what I would most like people to gain from experiencing my work. And in terms of what to gain from experiencing this film, I think all of us must ask ourselves, well, this history professor once told me that the reason you look back at history, or an important part of a lesson of history, is to put yourself in that circumstance and ask yourself what you would have done as a means of preparing yourself when you're in that circumstance. And there are a lot of people that you can ask yourself about in this story. What would have happened had you been one of those white students who appeared to be ready to beat up Gary's nephew? Would you have refused to testify? Would you have attempted to stop the fight? If you're Gary's mother, knowing of the very real possibility that your son could be murdered, would you have stood up in that way? I'm not even so much saying that you should take the positions that these people took because they came with some great risk and potential loss. But in exercising those moral muscles, even in the absence of an immediate threat, you put yourself in a better position to be a moral force in whatever minor way might be appropriate in the circumstances of your own life.
Thank you. Beautiful. Matthew?
Gosh, that's a good answer. Two good answers. Yeah, I think for me, from the film, I think Lolis is right on. I think that would be my hope as well. I think that's one of the things the film does really beautifully. From my book, I think I I hoped that, because I get a little more into the details of the like local organizations that were part of this decentralized sort of web that Lolis's father worked with very successfully for many years, you know, in pushing civil rights. And I always hope that the readers will come away with a sense of that you don't need a Martin Luther King, you know, and that the civil rights movement was bigger than that. And so we don't need that. I mean, I think it's one of the things that Black Lives Matter shows really brilliantly, is that the powerful movement is not the one with a charismatic head. It's the decentralized, localized one, right? And, you know, and I hope that people come away from the book with that. In terms of what I want to put out in the world, I don't know. You know, if I think small about this stuff, and the most important comments for me when I finished the book, when I was working on it, when I was fact checking it, you know, were always when the people who I met in Plaquemines would tell me that I had gotten it just right. You know, there was a Harold Jones, a cousin of Gary's, called me up shortly after the book was published. He had bought it and read it, and he was like, "Man, he's like, I lived that, and that was just how it was." You know, and that's, as a writer, that's really all I can hope for.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, I'd like to thank you two gentlemen for joining us. Before we get out of here, can you two individually please just state your name, again, your contribution, whatever links, websites, social media things that you have, so that the people can follow you, and just some last words to leave us with.
My name is Lolis Eric Eli. I'm the son of one of the lawyers who worked on Mr. Duncan's case portrayed in the film. I'm on Twitter at Lolis Eli, LOLISELIE.
And I'm Matthew Van Meter. I wrote Deep Delta Justice, which is the book on which A Crime on the Bayou is based. I'm at bymatthewvanmeter.com, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
Nice. Well, again, gentlemen, thank you. And once again, my name is Shaadie, SHAADIE. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all on that, Google and everything. Shameless plug. I would love to work with you guys in any way possible that you need when it comes to creativity as a entertainer, singer, songwriter, MC, host, on-camera personality, as well as behind the scenes coordinator, just connecting the dots and helping people find those that they need to connect with, even though they don't know they need the connection. I'm more of a puzzle master and a puzzle piece put together. I see the puzzles when no one sees it, and I put the pieces together. So I would love to help on any things, whether it's talking and speaking with you, Matthew, with the things that you're doing with the prison system, or you, Mr. Eli, with the films and movie things that you're doing with TV, which is definitely up in my realm. So anything that I can do to help, I'll be reaching out to you guys as well on social media so we can stay connected. And I would love to help get this film and this story out anyway. So please don't hesitate to let me know what I can do for my social media as a platform as well. And thank you to Willie and Utah Humanities, as well as UMOCA, for hosting this event. And I look forward to working with you guys again and getting some more material.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, indeed. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for making it happen, Shaadie.
Thank you. You guys have a great evening.
Okay. Take care.
Go ahead.